The latest. Thank you for your love and support. I appreciate you all. Africa, we say we are independent, but there are some people who are still paying colonial tax, and we ask, are these nations independent? When yellow people came into Africa to colonize us, after everything, when they wanted to leave, France decided that Africans have to still be paying France for all the infrastructure, the railways, and the other things that they've given to Africa. That they built these things for free. And we know these things were not built for free. These things were built so that France will have easy access of mobility. That was why they built all these roads and everything. And if it is schools, they did it so that we'll be able to communicate with them, so that they can train people in their language to be able to communicate with them, for them to have easy access of everything. But today, these people are saying that these colonies have to still be paying them for all the things that they have done. But they have not been able to pay these countries all the damages that they've caused them. And Africa is quiet. African Union is quiet about this injustice. These things were done by the president, Charles de Gaulle. When they colonized Africa and they were leaving, that the colonies have to sign that they will keep their central reserve there. They will be paying colonial taxes. Even if they discover anything on their soil, France should have the first-hand information. If they are going to sell or negotiate or do anything, France must always have the final say. France have to also print the CFA franc that they are using. Yes, even though France is not using it. And the money we have, the Central and the Western Africans that they've colonized. So the Central Africa, like DR Congo, Cameroon, they cannot even exchange the same money that is printed to them by France. Like West Africa, we know Togo, Benin, Niger, Mali, and the rest. What kind of system is this? These people are forced to save 65% of their reserve in France. And when they are going for their own money, they have to still pay interest.
While some leaders are currently struggling to break free, others have become so used to this evil system and taken advantage of it to enrich themselves. Recent reports reveal that decades after independence, France continued to exert its influence on some African countries through what is known as colonial tax. According to France, these African countries ought to pay for the cost of infrastructure and buildings it built over 100 years ago. How does this make sense? It doesn't, but that is the reality of 14 African countries. In this video, we will give you a background history of how the tax came to be, the impacts in African countries, and how some countries are breaking free. In 2019, a diplomatic row erupted between France and Italy over increased migration to Europe, with Italy's Deputy Prime Minister Luigi Di Maio accusing France of impoverishing African countries, stating that, if today we still have people leaving Africa, it is due to several European countries, first of all France, that didn't finish colonizing Africa. He further said that France was controlling the economies of 14 African countries that use the CFA franc, a CFA franc-backed currency pegged to the euro. He then added, if France didn't have its African colonies, because that's what they should be called, it would be the 15th largest world economy. Instead, it's among the first, exactly because of what it is doing in Africa. It's been a few years since Italy's prime minister made this statement, and even before that, questions have been asked like, is France really robbing its former African colonies? Is the current relationship between African countries and France preventing successful African development and sovereignty? Let's give a little background story. Following the Congress of Vienna, which sealed Napoleon Bonaparte's fate, France could no longer claim to be a European, let alone an international power. The fall of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany in 1870 was the final nail in the coffin of France's world power status. And it was at that point that they shifted their attention to Africa. They were among the leaders in the enslavement, colonialism, and raping of the African continent. For more than 300 years, France governed more than 20 countries in Western and Northern Africa, encompassing around 35% of the continent. Countries such as Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Benin were used as slave trade centers by France during those years, and all resources in the region were exploited. They stole African gold, diamonds, and other natural resources to construct all of the magnificent structures you see in Paris today. In addition, uprisings launched by individuals fighting for France in the world wars with the promise of independence were mercilessly suppressed. The 5-century colonial period and wars of independence in the region killed more than 2 million Africans. Then, the era of the struggle for African independence began. African nationals who had traveled abroad and fought during World War II were exposed to the reality of nationalism, sovereignty, and independence. They began to agitate for a free state. After several years of fighting, President Charles de Gaulle reluctantly decided to hand independence, based on the French terms to former colonies in 1958. But as history tells us, it wasn't a complete independence. It came with conditions that gave France influence over the affairs of their former colonies. However, some African countries resisted this false independence. Notable among them was Sekou Touré of Guinea. Sekou Touré of Guinea saw the so-called independence for what it was and decided to pursue his own country's independence. However, this decision turned out to be a tragic one, because when the French colonial elites discovered this, they became so furious, and in a historic act of fury, they destroyed everything in the country that represented what they called the benefits from French colonization. They took all their possessions as they left and destroyed all they could not take, including schools, nurseries, buildings of the public administration, cars, books, medicines, instruments of the research institute. Tractors were crushed and sabotaged, horses, cows on farms were killed, and stored foods were burned or poisoned. As scandalous and outrageous as this act was, it was obviously to send a message to all the other 14 colonies that the consequence for rejecting France's terms would be very high. This was how fear slowly spread through all the other African elites, and no other country found the courage to follow the example of Sekou Touré, whose slogan was, "We prefer freedom in poverty to opulence in slavery." Thinking of finding a solution to the problem, Sylvanus Olympio, the first president of the Republic of Togo, a small country in West Africa, found a middle ground solution with the French. Sylvanus didn't want his country to continue to be a French dominion, so he refused to sign the Colonization Continuation Pact de Gaulle proposed. However, he agreed to pay an annual debt to France for the so-called benefits Togo got from French colonization. This is insane. What kind of benefit did Togo or any other African country gain from colonization? According to France, it was they who built roads, railways, and other transport infrastructures. They built schools and churches and introduced the concept of education to Africans. They said they brought civilization, and without them, Africa would have remained uncivilized. While it is true they built transport infrastructures and the rest, to call that the benefit of colonization is an insult to the millions of people that endured and died in slavery. It would be an insult to several African cultures and identities that were eradicated as a result of colonization. The most annoying thing is that these infrastructures were not even built for the sake of Africans. These infrastructures simply helped to facilitate the colonization process. The transport network, for instance, helped to transport Africans and African resources from the colonies to Europe where they were exploited. It is quite pathetic that the Togolese leader agreed to pay for these so-called benefits, but the reality is that this was the only condition for the French not to destroy the country before leaving. However, the amount estimated by France was so big that the reimbursement of the so-called colonial debt was close to 40% of the country's budget in 1963. Consequently, the financial situation of just independent Togo was very unstable, and in order to get out of this situation, Olympio decided to leave the monetary system set up by colonial France, the FCFA, and create a new currency for his country. Sadly, on January 13, 1963, just 3 days after he started printing his country's own currency, a squad of illiterate soldiers backed by France killed the first elected president of newly independent Africa. Olympic was reportedly killed by an ex-French Foreign Legionnaire army sergeant called Etienne Gnassingbé, who supposedly received a bounty of $612 from the local French embassy for the hitman job. This was how Olympio's dream for a truly independent nation died with him. But Olympic Sylvanus was not the only leader who was killed by the French because they sought independence from France. On June 30, 1962, Modibo Keïta, the first president of the Republic of Mali, decided to withdraw from the French colonial currency CFA, which was imposed on 12 newly independent African countries. For the Malian president, who was leaning more to a socialist economy, it was clear that the colonization continuation pact with France was a trap and a burden for the country's development. But again, like Olympio, Keïta became a victim of a coup carried out by another ex-French foreign legionnaire, Lieutenant Moussa Traoré, on November 19, 1968. In fact, during that turbulent period of Africans fighting to liberate themselves from European colonization, France repeatedly used many ex-foreign legionnaires to carry out coups against elected presidents. These include David Dacko, the first president of the Central African Republic, Maurice Yameogo, the first president of the Republic of Upper Volta, now called Burkina Faso, and President Hubert Maga, the first president of the Republic of Benin. In sum, during the last 50 years, a total of 67 coups happened in 26 countries in Africa. 16 of those countries are French ex-colonies, which means 61% of the coups happened in Francophone Africa. This demonstrates how France is quite desperate and active to keep a strong hold on its former colonies, whatever the cost. Now let's talk about the Colonial Pact. The Colonial Pact signed between France and the African colonies maintained French control over the African states' economies. It took possession of their foreign currency reserves. It controlled the country's strategic raw materials. It stationed troops in the country with free passage. It demanded that all military equipment be acquired from France. It took over the training of the African police and army. It required that French businesses be allowed to maintain monopoly enterprises in key areas such as water, electricity, ports, transport, and energy. France not only imposed import restrictions on a variety of commodities from outside the Franc zone, but it also imposed minimum volumes of French imports. These treaties, as inhumane as they are still in force and operational. For the past half-century, the clandestine and powerful African cell has handled France's strategic interests in Africa, reporting only to one person, the French president. Some of the obvious repercussions of a dependency policy for African countries include reliance on the French economy, on the French military, and an open-door policy for French private enterprise. So in fact, what Italian Prime Minister Luigi stated is correct. France is the West gendarme in Africa. Its dominion is exercised through a murky network of informal empires, with dominance in trade, banking, military, and political control. Till today, all the Francophone countries remain slaves of the French. They continue to pay an unfair colonial tax as compensation for non-existent benefits of French colonialism, which makes no sense because they are the ones who came to colonize Africa and are therefore supposed to compensate Africa for centuries of enslavement, colonization, rapine, and outright grand larceny. Aside from the colonial debt, all Francophone countries have their national reserves kept by France in the Central Bank of France. According to estimates, France has almost $500 billion in African countries' money in its treasury each year and will go to any length to maintain it. Furthermore, African countries do not have access to this money. In fact, France forced its former colonies, CFA countries, to deposit 65% of their foreign currency reserves in the French treasury, plus another 20% for financial liabilities, leaving them with only 15% of their own money. And if they require additional funds, they must borrow from France at market rates. Thus, these African republics are French taxpayers, but their populations are not French and do not have access to the public goods and services that their money helps to fund. It's no surprise that France is so developed because they fund themselves with money from Africa. One major question is, do French people realize they have been living off the wealth of African countries for over a half-century? And if they do know, do they care at all?
Yet no one is talking about us. Africans ourselves, we are not ready to fight this system. We are not ready to fight this oppression. Nobody is talking about this injustice. How can we be here and we are paying somebody who came into our continent to cause us harm? That's the lazy way of raising revenue. That is why Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso rose up to say enough. And that is why they are fighting this system. And instead of the rest of the countries that are also oppressed in this manner to join, They are there, allowing themselves to be used against Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Look at the pain we are going through during and after colonization. Look at all the sufferings. And these people are still not satisfied. They still want to sit down and be making something out of Africa. Why is the African not ready to fight for freedom? In this 2025, African nations are still paying colonial taxes. There were some leaders who rose up to fight this. Some decided not to pay. The first person came from Guinea. The president at the time said no. And we know what they always do to our people. They will always fight these leaders who resist them. Another one rose from Mali. He was also compelled to come back to the negotiation table to dance to the oppressor. Some leaders in Africa didn't see the necessity of what these people were asking us to do. And they try to fight these things, but they always have a way of making our leaders to do what they want to do. Before you can fight these people, you should be brave enough. Like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. That's why we are asking all of us to unite, because we can't continue to be paying colonial taxes in this 21st century when the opposite should be the case. We cannot fight these people individually. We need to come together as a people and fight all this injustice that is meted on the African, because nobody will fight for us. Nobody will fight the battle for the African if the African is not ready to fight. United we stand, divided we fall, and united we keep standing forever and ever. The greatest enemy of the African is mental slavery. So let's decolonize ourselves from mental slavery. Let's keep sharing to educate our brothers and sisters. Together we make Africa great for ourselves and the next generations that are going to come. So that's the latest around the world and in Africa.